Greetings, campers, and welcome to the month of fairy folk. Or, if you prefer, pixie, gnome, elf, goblin, dwarf, fae, troll, sprite, etc., etc. These magical and mystical creatures that live in the otherworld can be both benevolent and sometimes deadly. No matter what name you use, there will still be someone who fears at least one of those spine-chilling names. While some believe these creatures to be demoted angels, others believe they were actually a former god, struck down in their godly status by lack of belief. Meanwhile, there are a few remaining who believe that the fairy folk are their own separate species. Regardless of where they hail or what they once were, they have always instilled a mixture of fear as well as awe, and on occasion camaraderie. Sadly, as with anything and everything, there are those who have to learn the hard way that the fae, no matter what you call them, are definitely not to be trifled with. So why don't you come, take a seat by the campfire, and I'll share a little history, a little lore, and a few stories about the fae. Now, some do not even like to say the name fairy, or any of those names I mentioned earlier. They are hesitant to refer to them as anything other than the friendly folk, or even the good folk, in the hopes that they will not be harmed. But don't worry, you're not all that important to them in their eyes. And as for me, my interactions have always been polite and beneficial, with a little mischief mixed in there. Personally, I have worked with not only house fae, but also with woodland fae. Now, while compiling this podcast and gathering my notes, I realized that just trying to group these like-minded fae folk could become quite difficult for my listeners. So I decided to focus on the fae based on their locations, and if they lived in the woods, the seas, or if they were known to live inside the homes or in caves, or more like underground mounds, in the hopes that this would be a little bit more understandable. And like I said, all of my interactions have been fairly respectful. And yes, somewhat, mischievous is the best way to put it. But also helpful. And honestly, never dangerous. If time allows, I may share a few of my own encounters, as there are a few parks that I seem to have a connection with. And while I've been at these particular places, I've received a number of offerings, some of which have been bones. And I do have a bit of a fascination with bones. Other gifts include particular stones that are just, they're in a place where they really wouldn't be expected to be. Now, other people who might not be looking for such things may just see this as a coincidence or just a bone, something, that is just there and, they really don't concern themselves with. But for me, when I've gone to these places and I have asked for some signs or some communication, I almost always receive a response. And it's usually stones, bones, interesting things that you wouldn't normally find in the middle of a park. But that's if we have time, because the ancient stories of the Anglo-Saxons, they paint a much different picture. During their time, they referred to the fae as elves, spelled Aelves. When one has done something to these elves, they usually have made them angry, and they can do a number of things, these elves, including harming that person, or going after a loved one, and even hurting their livestock. Before we even start with the curses, let me first list off the early descriptions of these elves. because these elves were actually human size. And by all documentation, they were extremely good looking. I mean, jaw-dropping good looking. They seemed to have a glow about them. And I think I also should interject here and remind those listeners that the images we have now of elves and fairies, really short, pretty and, Tinkerbell-esque. That's Disney, and let's just leave Disney over there, because that's not what I'm talking about. The written documentation that we have is much different than what was made up for TV ratings. And I also want to include here that those who wrote these histories and these legends were not in fact the Anglo-Saxons themselves. They were the Christians. And as we have learned, those with the pen can add whatever they want. So when reading ancient texts, you can see how the priests who were, taking down these stories, you can see how they kind of sprinkled in their own little bit of Christianity to try and eventually morph what was the Anglo-Saxons into more of a Christian accepted story. And even though it was said not to trust these elves because they were in all accounts tricksters, there were times when one could look to elves for assistance. You just had to be on your toes. And even then, the Anglo-Saxons adopted ways to try and appease the elves. And I think this is probably one of their ways of staying on the elves' good side. And that is by naming their children with, I don't want to say an elf name, but they add the actual name elf, Aelf, to the beginning of their own names. So that's kind of how they got the name Alfred and Alfric. These names contain the words elf, and a number of people believed it was to either protect their child or to somehow gift their child some of the elves' beauty and strength and allure. Because in Anglo-Saxon language, the word elf means white being. Sadly, though, the exact truth on how the Anglo-Saxon people dealt with their elves is mixed with those who, kind of wrote in their own beliefs. So we have documentation that was based off of actual accounts and then sort of morphed and combined with other pagans, including the Scottish people, Irish, and even Welsh people. So we have a few muddled descriptions, and we have a little mixing and matching here going on. But let's not ignore the fact that these legends that came from the Welsh, that came from the Scottish, that even came from those in Iceland, they hadn't always been aware of each other, and yet they still all had this mystical being. This ancient, mystical, sometimes devious, sometimes helpful, but definitely an otherworldly being that they seemed to try to live with. Oh, and fun fact, campers, there is a document, actually a book, that has been recently translated. It's been a few years, but the book is called The Bald Leech's Book. It is a book of remedies that include medical cures, as well as elfin cures and charms, and even food recipes that the Anglo-Saxons documented back in the 10th century. Now, this book is currently available online. You can actually purchase it. And, before I continue, when I say the Anglo-Saxons documented, I should say it was written down, again, by Christian priests. So there is some Christian prayers and things that the scholars are saying probably really wasn't an Anglo-Saxon belief. But again, those who have the pen gets to write the story. Back to the book, though. Here is something that is truly fascinating. So just stay with me here. The book contains a cure for an eye infection. And it's actually a poultice. It contains onions, garlic, wine, and bovine bile salts. Now, this mixture was combined in a cauldron and left to sit for 9 days, upon which time it would then be applied to the eye. Scientists have reviewed these ingredients, okay, and they made the mixture and they decided to test it against bacteria. They actually found that it is a remedy for MRSA. That's MARSA. And if you don't know what MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. It is a very nasty bacterial infection, and it is actually highly, highly, highly antibiotic resistant. Meaning all the antibiotics that we have now made from all big farm cannot fight this MRSA bacteria. However, the Anglo-Saxons had a cure. That's just mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. But anyways, back to the Fae. If we venture over to Scotland, there is actually a land of the Fae, and it is called Elfame. And there is a queen who resides over this special land, and her name is Nic Naveen. Now, interestingly, on the day of Samhain, which we just celebrated a few weeks ago, it would have been a perfect time to provide some offerings to Queen Nic Naveen in hopes of a gentle winter. Some of those things would be pumpkins, gourds, and goose eggs, as the goose was actually one of her epithets. Now, here's where the fairy, quote-unquote, gets a little bit muddled in Scotland. Before the world of machinery, before Christianity took its hold, the Scottish people were very much in tune with their lands, as I'm sure were the people from Ireland and Greenland and Iceland. They worked with the land. They were very much a part of it and were connected to it. Instead of trying to sort of strong arm and push what they want from the land, they could read the signs. And by that I mean, they could watch the herds, the wild herds that would, travel around, and they could see if they were heading in one direction or another. Were they on one side of the mountain than another, which could signify a storm was coming? They would watch the trees, and you can actually kind of determine when the weather is going to go bad just by when certain leaves tend to fall. And the Scottish people felt that this was a sort of mystical guide that could help make the waters run, the seasons change, and the harvest bountiful. The cat She I had mentioned in episode 20 describes one such mystical guide. There are actually quite a few quote-unquote mystical guides or fae-type creatures that were also referred to as She, like the banshee. Now, the banshee, this type of fae comes from Ireland. So we're going to hop over to Ireland. If we break the name up, we have the word ban, which is actually a little more pronounced like bean in the Irish tongue. And this word actually means woman. Then we have the second half, she, which again in the Irish tongue, means mound. So if we put the two together, we get the woman of the mound, the banshee. And the banshee has been terrorizing many a young child and elderly folk for many years. Now, the banshee is usually covered with some sort of translucent cloth, just enough so that you can kind of see her, but not get a really good look. Her age, though, is a thing of controversy. Sometimes she is older, with sharp and gnashing teeth, while other times she's young, very beautiful, but with blood-red eyes from wailing. Wailing because she knows someone is going to die. She was a warning. She wasn't the bringer of the death. She was the one who was warning you someone is going to die. Now, camper, I'm going to start wrapping this up, but first, I thought I would give you a few stories. These stories have traveled down throughout the roots of time. And you can tell me if you think these stories are to be believed or not. Now, back when the Fae could be seen, there was a man named Fergus. He was a hard-working laborer and worked on a farm. One day, he had been sent out to cut peat and found a perfect patch in a place called Merlin's Crag. As he began cutting the peat, a fairy woman appears out of nowhere, stops him in his tracks. She demands he put the peat back on her house. That peat was her part of her roof. Fergus, beyond terrified, but too afraid to return to the farm empty-handed, he hurriedly grabbed the peat he had cut from the fairy woman's house and hightails it back to the farm. Once he got back, he realized she hadn't followed him. He looked around and nothing menacing was coming at him. No fairy. No threat of violence. No attack of any kind. And soon, he ended up forgetting about the whole incident. Just put it out of his mind. Roughly a year goes by, and Fergus is casually walking back to his home from a long day's work when he passes the spot that he had cut the peat from. Whilst looking at the missing spot of peat, dear sweet Fergus is overcome with a sense of sleepiness. He can't help it, so he decides to take a nap just next to the spot where the missing peat is. All of a sudden, he is awoken to the sound of fairies. Shocked, he looks to see that he is surrounded by the Fae, and in the midst, a most beautiful woman, more beautiful than he had ever laid eyes on before, is beckoning him to come and dance with him. They danced, and as they danced, Fergus begins to realize that the fairies are slowly ending their little dance party and are beginning to retreat into the woods of Merlin's Crag. And he cannot help but start to follow them. No matter how hard he tries, he is not able to stop his body from following the Fae. And it is this moment that he recalls the threat the Fae woman had promised him a year ago. He would pay. Closer and closer, Fergus gets to Merlin's Crag, when all of a sudden he is enveloped. Now, to him, it felt like he had only been there a day before he burst through the woods and rushed home to apologize to his wife and children for not returning home that night. He got to his front door and flings it open wide, rushing in, about to shout for his wife when he sees two teenage children standing in front of him. "Who are you?" he shouted in between breaths. Before they could answer, his wife appears from around the corner. She looks different, and he stares at her puzzled. "Who are they? Who are they?" she screams. "They are your children. You had abandoned us. You've been gone for 7 years. Well, looks like spending a night with the Fae is really not just spending a night with the Fae. How about one more, camper? This one is about the fairy flag of Dunvegan Castle. There was a man, a chief actually. He was the chief of the MacLeod clan, and he had fallen ridiculously in love with a beautiful and brilliant woman. And she had fallen just as hard for him. But there was one hitch. She was a fairy. And not just any fairy. She was a fairy princess. Oh, but they were in love. They were in just so much love. And together they went to her father, asking for his blessings. The fairy king knew that his daughter would be heartbroken when her husband died, as she was immortal. So he offered them this agreement. He would give them his blessing on one condition, that after a year and a day, she would return to the fairy realm. Now, when that time came, the fairy princess not only had to say goodbye to her husband, but also to their newborn baby. She made MacLeod promise her that he would never let the baby cry, as the sound would travel to her ears no matter where she was, in this world or the other, and she just could not bear it. Now, MacLeod mourned for his wife, and he was in just a horrible state. His clansmen wanted to do something to bring him out of this, so they decided to throw him a birthday party. And they threw him the most lavish of all parties. And although MacLeod was still heartbroken, the festivities began to lift his spirits. In fact, it was such a hit that the nursemaid who was in charge of watching the baby was so enthralled that when she made sure the baby was sleeping, she slipped away to join in the fun. The music and the cheering was so loud that no one heard when the baby woke. No one, that is, but the baby's mother. Through all the cheers, all the music, all the noise, that fairy mother heard her baby cry. And as the party died down, MacLeod went to check on his baby. He found the baby asleep and swaddled in a silken cloth that no one recognized. He questioned the nursemaid, who admitted to leaving the baby while it was sleeping, but she swears she was only gone for a short time. At that moment, Chief MacLeod knew that his baby had cried and his wife had heard. From that day on, that shawl became the fairy flag of Dunvegan Castle. Whenever the clan was in danger and needed assistance, all they had to do was wave the shawl and the fairy folk would come to their aid. The shawl had been waved and saved the clan from dire battles. It saved the castle from an actual raging fire, and it even saved a herd of sickly cattle. The flag, although torn and tattered, is still kept at the Dunvegan Castle on the Isle of Skye. Wow, campers, that was a good one. And I think I will end this campfire here. The history of the Fae, no matter what land we are, is vast and rich. And I wish to do them justice and stay on their good side. So I hope you have enjoyed this little venture. The fire is dying down, and part 2 will be released on November 25th, where I will have a new fire and new Fae stories. As it is right now, I am only able to release one episode every other week as I work full time. And I have 2 children. One is about to graduate high school and head off to college, and another one is just entering high school. So things are a bit busy here. Not to mention, I am planning on selling my house coming spring, and I do want to do a few touch-ups to get the house ready. So in the meantime, campers, if you have a story of the Fae or some good folk, and you would like to share it, please feel free to send me a message. I would love to hear them and share them. Of course, if you prefer to remain anonymous, all you have to do is let me know. You can email me at campfireghoststories8@gmail.com. That is campfireghoststories, the number 8, at gmail.com. And to keep up to date on all the happenings around the campfire, I am on Instagram at Campfire Ghost Stories and also Facebook, Campfire Ghost Stories, but I'm not as active. Oh, and if you haven't heard, I have a Patreon page. For just $5 a month, you can join my drink and divination tier. I share some drinks, usually teas, to enjoy by campfire. Some are for enjoyment, while some might have a medicinal element to them, and I'll let you know. I also share a little divination for whomever may need a little extra insight, and I am compiling other goodies to share as well, including some campfire foods, so please feel free to join and help keep the campfire burning. Happy camping!